So some Republicans, such as Senators Rand Paul, Mike Lee, said that the briefing earlier this week on Iran just wasn't enough. So if the president, what he is saying is accurate, does this now put pressure on the White House to turn over more intelligence to lawmakers?
I think in the political world it does, but in the policy world it certainly doesn't. And the reason I draw that distinction is anyone who's known anything about Qasem Soleimani and the threat he poses knows the kind of activities he's been engaged in for almost 2 decades in Iran's near abroad. When you look at Iran's activities in Afghanistan and then, of course, go west in Iraq and Syria, the countries Iran is trying to create and sustain this land bridge through so it can funnel men and weapons to different conflict zones to save Assad and to fight against ISIS, as well as grow the power of Shia militias in Iraq. Qasem Soleimani did exactly that. He did exactly engage in acts of terror. He did exactly support assassinations. He exactly armed, trained, equipped Shia militias, supported the use of child soldiers, supported the use of force to defend a dictator like the type of one that we have in Syria, such as Bashar al-Assad. This is the thing that has gotten Qasem Soleimani his fame and accolades in Iran for the past 2 decades, as he was promoted from brigadier general to major general and led the Quds Force for 23 years. So anyone who knows anything about him, as well as the 600 plus Americans and coalition forces who he killed through IEDs and EFPs in Iraq, knows that terrorism is what he does when he's abroad. So when he is abroad, especially when he's liaising with the head of another designated terrorist group, it's not like they're there to enjoy Iraq's fine culinary cuisine such as Moscow fish. They're there to engage in retribution. Iran and Iran-backed militias had gone to a de-escalation. First they killed an American, then the U.S. responded with military force against an Iran-backed Shia militia. Then they looked to not kill an American, but of course take over the compound where the U.S. embassy is in Baghdad. And then they realized that wouldn't be a sufficient show of force. So while they were going to go, so it made sense for them to go escalate even further. Now, for the political world, it would behoove the administration to put out the evidence to put an end to all of this. But anyone who's even remotely known anything about Iran's foreign policy abroad would see this arc of Soleimani's career and know exactly what he was doing abroad.
So on the same day that Soleimani died, CBS News can confirm that the military unsuccessfully tried to kill a senior official, what they said of Iran's Quds Force in Yemen. What's your read on that?
That the U.S. military tried to also strike a Quds Force official in Yemen? That would make sense to me. Also, it would represent Washington finally understanding and acting on the threat that Iran poses in Yemen, which is Iran has long used the Houthis, which have predated the Iranian campaign in Yemen, as they've been a major force there. They're a nationalist insurgency in that country. Iran has co-opted them, given the war with Saudi Arabia, to make them into something of a proxy. Now, they're not a full-blown proxy yet, so that's why the Quds Force is there, to train, advise, equip. So if the U.S. did this, or even attempted to do this, or is alleged to do this, it would represent a change in Washington's understanding of the conflict in Yemen and a change in Washington's willingness to combat Iran's footprint in Yemen on the ground of that country. Until now, it's mostly been support for interceptions of Iranian weaponry rather than targeting. So if it is true that the U.S. did try to target, that would be a change.
Mm-hmm. So Iraq is asking the U.S. for a delegation to discuss pulling troops from the region. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has rejected that request. He says there needs to be more of a dialogue. The president has often said that he wants troops to come back home from the Middle East. Where do you see this ultimately landing with the situation of U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq?
I'm glad you mentioned Iraq, and we should remember that this is 2020, where the president is an election year. Again, as you mentioned, he's promised to pull troops out of the region. There haven't been that many calls by, I think, senior administration officials to pull troops out of Iraq, partly because they understand that this is really the front lines against Iran, and of course the counter-ISIS mission is still ongoing. Admittedly, it went through a pause because of the escalation with the Iranians. I think the Iraqi government now is looking to be more brazen than ever, particularly the pro-Iran-backed groups in parliament, as well as the rest of the political elites that are more beholden to Tehran than to Washington. And let's not forget here, every time there's a crisis, every time there's an escalation in the region and in the neighborhood, Iran has looked to use that as a predicate to evict American troops from conflict zones. And Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, as well as other Iranian political officials, have talked about capitalizing on the death of Soleimani to evict America from Iraq. So expect that to be a debate that draws out in 2020, to touch the politics of the election, to touch the politics of Iran, the politics of Iraq, and the policy of who wins Iraqi hearts and minds.
Behnam Ben Taleblu, thank you very much for joining us, Behnam.